I
Okay.
hear that. Okay. All right. Well, that was that's new. Well, we are being recorded. Well, I'll open this up in prayer, and then Aaron can just take it away. Um, Lord, we thank you for this time. We thank you for what you have taught us through trauma informed care and how you've grown us over the years and sustained us. And Lord, we desperately need more wisdom and discernment. We need more skills, and we are just completely dependent on your Spirit to guide us as we learn how to better serve our families and our kids, and how to better take care of ourselves as well. Lord, we just ask for so many who are currently hurting from trauma, and Lord, just the trauma of this recent week for our families. We just ask that you would be present, and you would be a comforter, and you would be a healer. Lord, help us to take the knowledge that we learned today and be able to apply it for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. But before we begin, um, if you didn't take those quizzes that we requested, that's fine. You can go back and self-reflect on that yourself. Um, but I also want to acknowledge that if um, the quizzes may have triggered you, may have brought up some things from your past that you didn't realize were still there, please feel free to block out your camera if you need to, or pause the video to really take time for yourself, because that's going to be key during this. Because some of the things we're going to talk about today are very hard and very depressing in many ways. And for us in particular, it's going to be very triggering as a staff too, especially with recent events. So just bear with us on that. I just want to acknowledge that and just prepare you for that. So I'm going to click to the next slide. So as we start, we want to acknowledge the places where we get the information from, the people that have done all the work, all the research, all the things that we're benefiting from. Trauma Free World is who I'm actually certified trainer through. It's a back-to-back organization. They're a global ministry that deals with trauma and children that have experienced trauma. And so they have a lot of really good resources that you can find online, and also purchase trainings. And if you want to learn more, that's one great way to do that. So is Conscious Discipline. Follow both of them on social media. They have a lot of good little snippet videos that you can watch and learn more, and hear it directly from the source as well. So please do so if you wish on that. You can click to the next slide. So to get us all on the same page, trauma can mean so many different things to so many different people. So we want to get what exactly we are talking about trauma. And essentially, trauma is stress. And in a developing child's brain, trauma, when they've experienced trauma or toxic stress, this can look like PTSD to them in the way they react, the way that their brains function, because they're stuck in the lower centers of their brain. So you can click to the next slide, Raquel. So this is a good acronym if you like acronyms. If you don't, just try to remember the words for it. Chronic, unpredictable, toxic stress. We can have positive stress in our lives that will help us form how to deal with stressful things, like a project that's due in 2 weeks and we have to get it all finished. But once we finish, we learn to calm down and come down from that. But when it's unpredictable and chronic, it becomes toxic to where a brain does not know how to calm down. And if a child grows up in an environment that is very traumatic or unpredictable, then the frontal lobe is completely cut off. And so as we talk about trauma, this is a good way to remember. Chronic, it means ongoing. Unpredictable, so anything can happen at any time, and the child or the adult knows this. And as we personally go through this as a staff, we know how unpredictable it is for us living in a broken world that we live in, and how toxic this can be for our brains as well. So continue. So this is going to be more of actual 7 risk factors. So we're going to talk about actual instances that can happen. So difficult pregnancy is the very first one. This is sometimes a abusive relationship. It could also be a situation where mom has health problems that causes things. But any kind of high stress, even a high stress job, can cause a traumatic background for a fetus or a baby in the womb, and it starts prenatally, and you have a difficult birth, which is more where there's a procedure that has to be done, and where sometimes it's like breach or whatever else. This can cut off parts of the brain as well and cause the brain to not develop properly. And you also have separation and hospitalization at birth, where you have them in the NICU, you have them being hospitalized, or separation for different reasons. Even recently with COVID, some of the moms were separated from their babies early on. And we know from studies that if a baby is ever separated from their mom in the first 12 months of life for a long period of time, where they're not returned back to them, then the attachment theory that you'll take a quiz on, that's where it's formed from. And so many times it can create where they don't attach to the world around them. They don't have self-regulation skills. They don't trust those that are taking care of them. And this many times happens when you have children from children's homes or even overcrowded DHR situations. So, all right, continue. Acute trauma, which is usually a one-time event. This is not an ongoing thing. It's like a car accident or earthquake or natural disaster that happened. And this is just a risk factor for anyone who could have experienced trauma. Abuse and going to neglect as well. These two sometimes can go hand in hand, but I would like to ask any of the participants here, which one do you think is worse, abuse or neglect for a child that is developing?
I would say neglect.
100%.
Yeah.
Because our brain development as humans is relationship dependent. And so if abuse tells a child, you exist, but I don't like you, neglect says you don't even exist. And so that has a major effects on the brain. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Go on to the next part, Raquel. System effects. We're going to have a big section on this coming up with Raquel. System effects can also be anything from any system that has been created that has been a risk factor for trauma, but it doesn't only, so most people only say it would be the foster care system, but it's also systems within our school systems, our governmental systems that have been created. But all these things that create a toxic, unpredictable, chronic kind of state changes how the body reacts to different things, how our brain reacts. Because when you have a lot of stress flooding your brain and the chemicals that do that, it shuts off parts of your brain to where you cannot function in your frontal lobe. You can't make good decisions. You're not in that moment. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced a major fear moment, but for me, coming from where I came from previously in Haiti, I was in a toxic, chronic state of trauma because of having to be evacuated, not knowing when I was going to make it to the grocery store, not knowing if you had enough water for a long period of time. And so this did a lot of things to my brain as an adult. And I can't imagine what it does to children that are in these environments. The belief system, we've talked about this in the other videos, but it's what we believe about ourselves, about the world around us, and ultimately about God. And you can sell like abuse and neglect. I don't exist for neglect. No one likes me. I'm not worth anything. Or I cannot be connected to someone, or even to the system effects. No one wants me, so they're going to put me in DHR custody, or I'm not worth the money for the government to put into my schools. Even that. Biology changes their whole biology and how their body reacts to different things. There has been studies done. You can read a book called Childhood Disrupted. It's a great book about this and how the 7 risk factors and the ACE study. If you score a 4 or higher, you will be more likely to suffer from an autoimmune disease based on your life experiences as a child in your first 18 years of life. and your health is considerably affected by that. And you can continue down to behavior. And ultimately, it changes the behavior. But all these things come together, and what we see is behavior. That's the symptoms that we see from the events that we've seen on TV and everything. And so with behavior in particular, we have to change our mindset, and we'll talk more about that as we go along, but I want to cover it real quick. Behavior is the language of a child who's lost their voice because they don't feel like they matter. They don't feel like they are worth anything, right? And so that's what we're looking at, and we're trying to see it as meaning behind the behavior. And so I'm going to let Raquel take it from here for system effects.
Yeah, as we go into system effects, I just want to, we're doing that so we can have some context for where we are. But even as we think about how trauma is passed down through generations, so when we talk about how our body, brain, belief system, biology, and behavior is impacted by trauma, that is passed down generationally. And it's actually fascinating to look at different studies that are being done right now of how even just survival modes of when parents go through trauma, how it's passed down genetically to children. And so they have some of the same survival responses, even if they've never been in that exact same situation. It's really fascinating to see that. So it actually is genetic as well. And so when we look at specifically our context here in America, so when we talk about system effects, many people didn't even use the phrase systemic racism or know that that was a thing or talk about that in conversation until last year. And last year during 2020 and everything kind of brought it to the front and center. But systemic racism is a really big issue in America. That's just the context that we're in. And so, but if you spend any amount of time at Oak Tree, you're going to quickly see the results of systemic issues, systemic trauma, systemic racism, whether you know it or not. That's just part of the context that we're in. And so we're going to back up, and I'm going to give kind of a little history lesson because that kind of matters for where we are in understanding not just trauma as individuals, but communal trauma. And so this quote here, I stumbled on it a few months back and have been just learning a lot from Resna Menakem, who's just has some incredible just studies on trauma communally. And so when he talks about, as America, that we have both the Black and white communities have trauma that has been passed down generationally. This quote just stood out to me because this is something that I think we've tried to articulate as a ministry and have had a hard time with in understanding the farther we get into this work. So trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualized over time looks like culture. And this is where we're at. When people look at public housing, they say that's the culture. When people look at our kids, they say those are bad kids. We've been dealing with that this weekend. When police have interactions with our kids, they say they need to be locked in an institution, in a ward. They need to be sent to a home. That's the lens that is given because the trauma has been decontextualized. All we're looking at is the behavior. And when our kids are having these interactions and we're having a runaway child, there's trauma that they're trying to communicate. It's not because this is a bad child, right? When we see parents who are struggling to cope and there are deep addictions, it's not because they're a bad parent and hate their kids. It's because there's decontextualized trauma over time, right? And so when we see an entire community where there are layers of issues, right? Where we have violence, where we have poverty, where we have crime and drug rates that are really high, that's because there are layers of generations of trauma here, right? And so also as I was just wrestling with these things lately, I came across someone was talking about how Native Americans talked about blood-borne memories. That was a way that they communicated trauma that's passed down through generations, right? They were saying it's something that we know. We look at our families and we see patterns, right? In the church, I hear a lot about generational sins, right, or things like that. Trauma is passed down. These patterns of either unhealthy coping or healthy coping are passed down. And so even when we think about systemic trauma and cultural trauma, in Alabama, we are standing on, as we quote Native Americans and the things that they have taught us, we are on ground that was stolen from the Creek Indians, right? And even before that, the Coosa, the Alabambo, I can't say it right, but Alabama is named after Native Americans, right? The indigenous people that are here. So as a nation, we have layers of complex trauma, right? Our nation was born out of trauma, people fleeing trauma and people coming and in greed displacing other people, right? So all of this is passed down. And so we have to contextualize where our cultures are at by looking at the past. So we are going to, people say all the time, like, what do you want us to do, Raquel? How much history do I need to learn, or how many books do I need to learn? This is by no means going to be an exhaustive history, but I want us to be able to have context for where we are today. If we're going to serve in public housing, we need to know, like, how did we get here? Because there's a lot of easy phrases, right? Like political catchphrases that have come from, you say, the welfare queen, or people stealing our tax dollars, all of those things. But those are just easy catchphrases that politicians have used in order for us not to look at the whole picture and understand our context. So we're going to break it down a little bit. So if we start in 1934, this is when the National Housing Act came into being. And so if you're white, you hear this, the New Deal. That was a great thing. This helped you tremendously. This is where we were recovering from the Great Depression. This gave incredible benefits for soldiers coming home from World War II. But if you were Black, this puts you further behind. So in this Housing Act is when race-based mapping started happening in 200 plus cities. And this is called redlining. So when real estate agents and when the banks, they actually made maps of cities marked in red lines to determine who could receive the funding through the New Deal for housing loans and all of those things. And so this is a map of Birmingham in 1933. So this is what came as a result, like right during when this New Deal is coming on, right? Redlining is coming into being through the National Housing Act. It's happening all throughout America now. But these maps were very, very common. And so you can't tell, but right over here in this small corner, I'm going to read you what it says. So the green is best. You guys know where this is? Right there, Mountain Brook, all right? The blue is considered still desirable. The yellow is labeled as definitely declining. The red is labeled as hazardous, and the gray here is labeled as Negro concentration. So this map was what determined your home value. This map was what determined if you were given loans and mortgages through the banks, right? So if you're in that red or gray area, you're not getting any of it, right? And so if we look at Birmingham today, this is the map. So if we go 1933, 2021, here's our home values. You see the lowest values in red there? Not much has changed. So red is the lowest value based on home value in Birmingham. Yellow is average, green is high, and then purple is top 1%. We don't have any purple here. But if we look, those lines are still there, right? And so when we talk about systemic issues, our schools are funded through property values, right? So if we look here, there's more gaps that are going on. And so we can't just say, oh, it's based on neighborhoods. Like, this is something that happened a long time ago and it has sustained through this, right? So next, 1949, the United States Housing Act passes, so it updates a little bit. It expands housing assistance. So before it was mostly veterans that were taking advantage of this. but in 1949, there's a national housing policy. So it becomes more holistic on that. So Marks Village was actually built as a result of the 1949 Housing Act. And so the government expanded its public housing communities. So Marks Village was built for white families. And Loveman Village in Titusville was built around the same time for Black families. So again, we see this result from the Housing Act, and Marks Village is built as a result of that. Marks Village has not been renovated since 1951 when it was built, just by the way. And so then we've got just some big history markers. So 1954 is when Brown versus Board of Education was happening. The Supreme Court didn't actually enforce that desegregation until 1955. 1956 is when the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights was formed. And that was a result of the NAACP being banned from operating in Alabama. And so this new group was formed in order to still move forward with civil rights. So the Montgomery bus boycott was happening in this year. At the same time as people in Birmingham are still being arrested for riding on public transportation and protesting that. This is when intense bombing starts happening in Birmingham. And so Reverend Shuttlesworth's house, different churches, Birmingham became known as Bombingham. So 1961 is when the Freedom Riders are attacked. 1962, Birmingham City Parks chose to close their gates rather than to integrate. And then we get to 1963, which is a really big year. So this is when Governor George Wallace gives his inauguration speech, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And this is when the foot soldiers are putting Birmingham on the global stage. This is when the Children's March is happening. This is when fire hydrants and all of that is happening, when Bull Connor is brutally using our police and firemen and everything against these foot soldiers and freedom marchers. And so as a result of this, as Birmingham goes on the global stage, a local judge, Judge William Jenkins, issues a new order. And the order specifically says it's against anyone boycotting, trespassing, parading, picketing, sit-ins, kneel-ins, which are Christians kneeling in white churches, right? Wade-ins for the pools, and inciting or encouraging such acts. So again, we see a system that immediately responds. And remember, we're America, freedom of speech and protest, right? But locally, our judge raised restrictions against the right to peacefully protest and all of those things. And Bull Connor then raises the bail from $200 to $300 to $1,500 in response. So again, our systems are set up in order to penalize civil rights leaders. And so then we see locally, Armstrong versus Board of Education finally tells Birmingham city schools that they must desegregate. Now remember, Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954. We are almost 10 years later when Alabama is saying this. So when that happens, Alabama state troopers arrive to block integration of schools. Governor Wallace closes multiple Birmingham city schools. And ultimately, the National Guard has to come in order to enforce integration and protect the students going to school. 16th Street Baptist Church bombing happens this year. And the letter from a Birmingham jail happens this year. And so, and at that same time, there was a request made for Birmingham to hire Black police officers, and that request was denied. So all of this, 1963 was a big year. And I just want to back up. And so if we're looking, I'm just going to give an example because Mr. Cowboy is our neighbor that everybody knows out here. he was born in 1946. Okay. So he's lived through all of this, right? These different housing acts. He was born right before the Housing Act that created Marks Village came into being. So that's just some context. This is recent history, right? That our neighbors have lived through. I mean, I know that me and Aaron leading this training are young, but we, this is not that long ago. So then we get to 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed. There's some progress. And in 1965, this is when HUD is developed. So the Housing and Urban Development Department is formed for national government. And that's also the year that the March on Selma happens. So if we're thinking about Alabama. 1968 is when Dr. King is murdered. And this is when the Fair Housing Act passed, which finally was enforcing an ending to redlining. But again, a lot of that damage had already been done. If we see those effects, redlining is not legal, but it definitely still, those principles still have a place in the way that our real estate and our housing economy goes. So then 1973, this is when I-2059 was built. So Birmingham is suddenly split. There's now a barrier between downtown Birmingham and a lot of the communities that walked there. And this displaced a lot of Black communities locally. So as the housing market is coming back, right, this is when this period of white flight has been happening through the civil rights era, right? So suburbs are being created. And in order for those people who have moved out, they're creating these new neighborhoods where Black people won't be next to them. They won't have to be neighbors. Interstates are created because now they need to commute back and forth to work a lot further, right? So that's part of that local, this is what's happening globally, but it's also happening right here in Birmingham. So then we're going to skip ahead. And so 1983 is when a judge finally ruled that the desegregation in Birmingham public schools had been achieved. Said complete, we checked that box. And again, desegregation legally technically has, but the damage that had already been done, our schools are still very largely segregated. If we look back at that map, in a second, we'll show you another one, things haven't changed that much. So then we enter in the period of the war on drugs and the crack epidemic. So the 80s and 90s, this is going on. And so this is when the tough on crime era happens. The crack epidemic is taking off because there's cheap and easy for drug dealers to make an easy profit. But again, if we're thinking systemically, there's different language that was used and different charges that were used for very similar drugs, but coming in different forms. And so for crack, which was much more common in lower income communities, predominantly people of color, had a lot higher sentencing than those that were used in wealthier communities. And so even now, if we think of the last few years, how the opioid epidemic has been labeled as a public health crisis, but the crack epidemic was a criminalization of an issue that was addiction, a lot of mental health, a lot of trauma, criminalized instead of seen as a public health issue. And so there's just a difference in the way things have been communicated and dealt with systemically. So in this era, this is when the prison population from 1980 to 2010 increased 222%. So we're now in the mass incarceration era, right? So here are just some statistics. 1 in 3 Black men born in America will spend time in prison. So when we look at our boys, we see that 1 in 3 of them are statistically going to spend time in prison. We see our boys that are already having interactions with police, and we see this school to prison pipeline is very real. So when, again, systemically, schools don't have the resources they need, all of these narratives that our communities are criminal are carried over into school. So when rates show when Black children and white children might have the same behavior issues, the Black children are much more likely to be suspended and expelled. Eventually, that leads to juvenile detention and to the prison system. So if we look at this, Black women, 1 in 18 compared to 1 in 11 for white women. 1 in 111, I'm sorry. 1 in 111 white women, but 1 in 18 for Black women. These are mothers, these are sisters, these are daughters who are likely to spend time in prison. 1 in 50 children in the US have a parent in prison right now. 1 in 50. So, and Alabama is the third highest rate nationally for the 50 states, the third highest rate of felony convictions, which bars people from voting. And so if we look back and we see how when our system started getting really extreme, during the civil rights movement, we see Bull Connor raising the bail, we see judges putting these things in place. There's just systemic racism that has been passed down, even if it's not called racism today, even if in our laws it might not say specifically Black or white, there's some economic and racial disparities that happen. And so as we're thinking about the American prison system, which we are top in the world for incarceration rates, and we are the land of the free, right? Our system thinks of retribution as justice, right? Like we need punishment, but the way of God is restorative justice. And so the way that our prison system is set up is not restoring people back into their dignity. It is not giving healing for these layers of generational trauma. It's not giving healing and freedom for those who have been, who have addictions and mental health issues. It is punishing, and it is keeping them locked in a prison system. It's just, anyways, there's so many layers here. So when we're talking about fatherlessness in our communities, we have to talk about this, right? And so even today in Birmingham, recently there's been a lot of buzz around it. I don't know, there's probably a lot of controversy on it, but Pardons for Progress was something that Mayor Woodfin put into place. And so what this did was clear criminal records for marijuana possession, right? So for petty drug crimes, those pardons were put into place. Some people say, well, they did a crime, so they deserve this. But what those crime records do is prevent people from getting jobs. And so they are able to serve their time, be released into society, and then still not be able to get a job to take care of themselves. So what is the most likely thing that they're going to do? Go back to selling or buying drugs, because that's the only place that they can get a job. So those kind of things, like our local policies matter, our national policies matter. It's complicated. It's very complicated. But when we're thinking about restorative justice, these are some examples of how this happens. So back to, this is what Birmingham looked like in 1933. This is Birmingham today based on race. So where majority Black are, that's the green, majority white is blue. So if we're looking at this, again, we saw the housing market is still the same. The lower income, majority Black, there's a major wealth gap that has happened here because these things have been passed down generationally. If your family got part of the New Deal and you got home loans quickly and you've been able to pass down some generational wealth, but if that was withheld for you for generations before you had access to it, and by the time you did have access to it as a Black family, you had been in survival for so long, your belief system had been constantly telling you, nobody wants to hire you, you can't do this, everything's set up against you, you don't belong here. There are layers here, right? So then this is the household income key. So again, red is the lowest, yellow is average, green is high, and purple is top 1%. So when we're talking about Oak Tree and we have conversations with local Black churches and with our community here that say, well, over the mountain people come in. Look at this divide where Red Mountain is. There's a clear divide between, it's a geographic divide between the Black and white communities still to this day, economic division still to this day. So we show all of this because we need to understand that there are layers of complex trauma and systemic effects that are not going to have easy answers. Complex trauma requires complex healing. We have got to address this from multiple angles. So as a nation, we spend a lot of time discussing the symptoms of our problems. Everybody's quick to say we have inner city crime problems, we have gun problems, we have drug problems, but we're really slow to talk about the root causes of how we got to where we're at today. So a doctor doesn't address every sickness with the same treatment, right? That would be careless. If we don't know what happened to cause a problem, we don't know how to treat the problem. So the how matters, the how we address these complex matters issues. These complex issues matters, right? And so we have got to look at this with complex trauma solutions. So I believe that the church is uniquely equipped to be a massive part of holistically rebuilding communities. God has equipped his church with what we need. But if we're only thinking of ministry in a form of charity and helping those poor people and helping, those less fortunate than us, and thank God for all we've been given, we're not looking at it as a form of justice, and we're always going to be putting a Band-Aid. We're never actually going to be healing. And God wants us to heal as communities. And as Dr. King talked about, the beloved community, for us to come together to address these problems. So again, complex, layered story. That was a really quick timeline, left out a ton of stuff, obviously, but we need complex trauma-informed solutions. So if you were at the last training, or go back and watch it, but we talked about Isaiah 61, 1 through 4. Verses 1 through 3 talk about the gospel, what Jesus came and did for us. He set the captives free, right? And verse 4 says that we, as oaks of righteousness, the people God raises up as a result of the gospel, what Christ has done, we will rebuild the ancient ruins, we will restore the former devastations, and we will renew the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. And so last time we talked about why do we do this? That's why we are gospel-centered, because we believe the only hope for something as deeply devastated as where we are today is the gospel, that Christ is the one who allows us to think of both justice and mercy at the same time. Jesus is the only one who has done that, made that possible through the cross and through his life. But how are we going to do this? How we restore the former devastations matters. Restoration is making like new. There's healing involved. And so that's why we do everything and constantly remind ourselves that we have to be a trauma-informed ministry, whether that's working with our kids, whether that is talking with their parents, whether that is looking at ourselves and why and how we do things and how we care for ourselves in this line of work. And so then next we will talk about what do we do? What does community support look like? So that was a fire hydrant, I know, and a lot of stuff, but that's where we're at. I'm going to let Aaron take back over.
Thank you, Raquel. And as I was looking at this timeline, I was looking at the dates, and this is in my mother's timeline of her being born into this in Birmingham. And she actually, for the first few years of her life, she was here in Marks Village. Actually, and Raquel has connections to that time period as well. And so just knowing my side of the trauma of what happened in Birmingham from a white family, and me not understanding the other side either. And so we're going to acknowledge both of those. I wanted to acknowledge both of those stories because it's essential that we do. And I'm very thankful for that we do that as a ministry. But as we go forward with our goals, so many times we have always done the things we've always done them. And that's the traditional discipline way. If you can go ahead and click on that, Raquel. The goal usually is to control and is to rules govern behavior. So like if I put enough rules and structure in place, behavior will follow. Everybody will comply, and the goal is to control and to do this. But in truth, those two things really cause this. My church always preached on it to parents, right? Growing up, about how if you completely control your child when they're underneath your roof and they go off to college, they're going to go crazy, right? And most of us did when we were under that kind of control. When we got to make our own decisions, we didn't know how to make the right ones. We knew what our parents wanted us to do, but we didn't know what was right for us in our decision making. And we didn't like conflict, and we still don't like conflict as a nation or as a church because of how things have always been done. And it's always a disruption to us. But the constant discipline, trauma informed way that we're trying to get across is the goal is to teach permanent behavior change. It's not about controlling the environment. So if a kid is cussing in front of me, right, and disrespecting, my first initial thing is not to correct their cursing. My thing is to get them to calm down first, and we'll talk how to do that to where we can learn and teach them how to be respectful in those moments. But at the same time, they're using their voice right now, and I'm thankful for that they're using their voice rather than they're in their survival mode, which we'll talk more about that in a second. But connectedness governs behavior. So if you're connected to a child and they feel connected to you, they're more likely to show the behaviors that you're expecting, but not all the time. It's not perfect, but conflict is an opportunity to teach. So much like our Peace Path video, if you've watched that already, that's kind of how our goal is. We use a moment of conflict that's going to happen. It's no matter what we do, no matter what kids we work with, conflict is going to happen, but how we approach it matters. So you can continue to the next slide. So as we look at this, like I was talking about with the brain modes, this is the survival mode. It's asking, am I safe? If you look here, the red dot in the brain, that's where we go in our survival mode. And this looks, continue on. Can you click? Okay. Usually nonverbal or non-coherent. So, and they can be aggressive and also freeze and flight back. So this looks different in every child and every person, and even us as we reflect about ourselves. For myself, I'm a fighter in survival mode, so I can be kind of aggressive. Okay, just naturally, that's how I am. And some people, they freeze completely or they flight back and they flee into their own mind to where they're not there. They're physically there, but they're not mentally there. And what the question we're always asking in this mode is, am I safe? And our response matters to that. You can continue on to the next one. So we're emotional. And the next one up is kind of like this midsection where it's kind of blue, is the emotional state. This is the part that we're in. We're connection seeking, act out through neediness. So like that attention connection seeking. I don't like attention seeking because of the negative connotations behind it, but connection seeking, saying, I want to be connected to you in this moment. And they're acting out through neediness. They're acting out through running away, using words, blaming everybody else in the situation. Oh, no, it's his fault that I'm here, and they may push you away, but still want connection. I kind of show the Heisman, kind of pose. They're pulling toward themselves, but they're pushing you away in defense at the same time. And that's what my attachment style, that's the ambivalent or I can't remember what the quiz said, but the ambivalent attachment style where you push and pull away. And that's my personal attachment style there. You can go to executive. The executive is where we want our kids to be, right? This is when you're like, this kid is awesome. I'm having a good day. They're asking, what can they learn? They're in their frontal lobe. They're able to sit down for long periods of time. They're able to talk to you about issues, use words, problem solving, all these things, right? And you can continue clicking through that. Self-regulation is something. They focus their attention, access moral reasoning so they can tell what's right and what's wrong in that moment. Because if this part of the brain is not lit up, then you're not going to get any of these things achieved. And the key here is that whenever we flip our lid, we use this is our brain, this is us in our frontal lobe. And then when we flip our lid and we're getting to our amygdala, which is that red section of our brain, this part of the brain is not accessed. We do not have self-regulation available. We cannot focus our attention. We don't know what's right and wrong. So when a child is in the emotional state or the survival state or the mode, we cannot expect the child to be there. But also, if we as the adult in the situation are not in our executive mode, we cannot expect the child in front of us to be brought up to their executive mode with us. They will only reach the level where you are. So if you're in an emotional state, you're screaming, we're yelling, we're going at it with a child, that child cannot access their executive functioning because of you. We are the ones in control of those situations. So as we go forward, we're going to talk about some really good strategies and practices that help us and the child in each in each mode. Okay. Survival mode practices. Composure is key. Self-regulation in action is the prerequisite skill adults need before disciplining children. So if you are not composed in the moment, you're not taking deep breaths, so like for me, I get really tense, and you can see it in my body language when I'm not composed. And then I have to take a deep breath and breathe. But with composure, as we work with children that are in their survival mode, we're expecting them to be composed when we're sitting there yelling at them or angry, or even our voice may sound playful, but our body language tells we're angry. And kids can read that 100% of the time. And so and Dr. Becky Bailey says it best, whomever you have placed in charge of your feelings, you have placed in charge of you. And so if we allow ourselves to get super angry with a child, we've already lost control. And we will be triggered by children's behavior, no matter what we do. And what we do as the adult matters. So we never can change what the child in front of us is doing. There's no control over that moment. But what we do in response matters. And so there's some ways for us to calm down our triggers. And I'm going to talk about some of my personal triggers. Lying is a big one for me. If a child is sitting there in front of me lying, it's not a good day for me. And I am automatically triggered into my survival mode or my emotional state, and I will go off. And recently, if you don't know, we have taken in 3 kids from DHR into my home. Me and my wife have been married a year and a half, and we have a 2, 4, and 6-year-old. So it's been quite stressful in our home. And I have been practicing composure, and I've failed so many times as a foster dad. And these are some things that I've had to do myself. Calming self-talk. I'm safe. Keep breathing. I can handle this. And I have to say it myself 3 times before it actually takes effect. But it actually does work. It sounds like fluffy rainbows and like that whole, psycho mumbo jumbo, but it really works to tell yourself, I am safe. Keep breathing. I can handle this in those moments. Because breathing and accessing parts of your brain, because I see it as a light. I'm back here, it's dark. I light up another part when I take a deep breath. A 3rd time, I light up my frontal lobe. And that's how 1, 2, 3. And that's how I do it. And then 2, change perception of the behavior. Q-tip, quit taking it personally. Because that's when someone lies, I take that personally. When I feel manipulated, I take it personally. Right? And so those are my triggers. So as all of us probably know some of our triggers, I want to discuss some of ours and how we can talk through those. Does anybody have any of those triggers when working with children or even adults for that matter? Because it can apply to that too. Of what behavior really just makes just your pet peeve you cannot stand.
It would definitely be lying.
Yeah, I feel you there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's adults, if I know someone's lying to me, that's it, It's very hard to change my perception.
Yeah. It's super hard.
Yeah, we were talking before this training how yesterday I failed multiple times at bringing a child out of the emotional survival mode. But one of the successes was I did have to stop, and I was like, I am trying to compete for control with this child. And that's never the spot where we need to be. That's never we can't win that. There's not even a win. And so I remembered what we had been talking about last week in training, and I took a breath and I said, all right, I'm going to step out of the room for a few minutes and I'm going to catch my breath because you're making me really mad and I don't want to be mad at you. So I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to go get some water. And when I come back, you can let me know if you're ready to do your homework and if we can be on the same team. And I left because I was not out of survival mode. And I was like, I just need to step back and reset. But I let the kid know what was going on because he knew he was making me mad, right? Like he could see whether or not I was saying the right thing. He could tell I was mad because, and today when I woke up, I felt it in my body. I'm like, yeah, yesterday I was holding my breath and I was tense a lot. And so it just made me aware that I was not physically taking the breaths that I needed to do and all of that to regulate myself. And so when I did that and when I came back in, I was blown away. We knocked out that homework so fast and it was great. Now from there on, we had other triggers and things, but for me, one of my triggers is if I'm hot or thirsty, things like that, I have to go. I know it's not the time for me to be outside and try to solve this with the kid. Sometime when I'm in a good spot, I'm like, all right, let's go and sit in front of the fan to talk because then I can actually think. But when I'm hot, it doesn't even matter what the kid did. It's just when I'm hot, I can't think straight and I am easily frustrated.
Anybody else have a trigger that I'd like to share? All right. Well, with the changing perception and the calming self-talk, this is something that we can do, but we have to be conscious of it, which is why they call it conscious discipline. We really have to be in our higher center of our brains to do this. And so, like Raquel said, she realized, okay, wait, I need to take a break. And that's okay. That's not breaking connection with that child. That's modeling for that child how to self-regulate in those moments of high stress. And that's key. And being honest with children is also key, and showing them the process that we go through, even as adults, is also key. Go to the assertive. With assertiveness, it is clear, vigilant communication that focuses children's attention on what we want them to do. And it's essential for setting effective and respective limits. And let me tell you, okay, even with a 2-year-old, this helps so much. Like you can say, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch 1,000 times a day to that 2-year-old, right? Or even a 16-year-old. Of don't go on that website, don't touch this, don't do that, right? But when we're assertive, we're focusing on what we want them to do instead. So like today, literally, my 2-year-old was in the corner on a table and he was grabbing a cup he wasn't supposed to have. And I said, put the cup down. And I told his name, put the cup down, get down and go and play with your bike. Immediately did it. And I had to do it assertively, because if our attention is focused on the problem, we're not open to a solution. So the problem in front of us is like he had a glass cup in his hand. He was about to get hurt. And we have to get those respective limits. So that way a child is not going to get hurt, or they respect us as the adult in the situation. And when they're in their survival mode, assertive is one of the best tools to use. So, but when we're upset, we must practice composure, switch our focus of what I don't want, into what I want the child to do, and telling what exactly we're expecting from them clearly set them up for success. And you have to, we're going to go through a little bit of a role practice next.
And I want to say this is where yesterday I was failing, because I kept saying, don't talk that way, or don't do that, and was not assertively telling him the correct directions to do, right? And so this takes a lot of practice to reframe our minds from don't do that to do this. Anyway.
Yeah. It is, I'm still not perfect at it. So as we look at it, many people get assertive and aggressive confused. Okay. But we're going to talk about passivity, aggression, and assertiveness and how we approach those. So passivity invites aggression. So when you are, Sam, please put your toys in the same bin, okay? And you pose it as a question, and you kind of like, I don't want to upset this kid. You're stepping on eggshells. You're being too passive, and it invites the aggression into the conversation. Aggression begets aggression, right? So if you're aggressive with a child, you're going to get an aggressive response back, right? And so we don't want that. So you don't have to act like that. You ought to be grateful I don't send you home, right? There's so many things. And even the reason why I chose this particular one is because so many times we think this in our heads unconsciously about a child, especially here at the treehouse. Like there's been many times that I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want to send this kid home, but he better be grateful. I'm just being graceful today. And I didn't realize I was doing that in my head. And that's automatically blaming that child. I'm in my emotional mode. I'm blaming that child in front of me. And, I'm not open to a solution in this moment. But assertiveness displays aggression. So it dissipates it. It makes it go away. It doesn't always work. There's a problem solving thing in our book that I can talk about at future trainings. But just to get the assertive roll down, Sam, pick up your toys and put them in this bin right away. So your name, verb, paint. So you're literally saying, Sam, in front of you, pick up the toys and put them in the bin right away. So let's use this as an example. Our scenario is a child is running around the treehouse. If you've ever been here, there's a spot that we try to fix that they kept running in circles and chasing each other, and everyone would get hit and hurt, everything else. So how can we solve that? We're trying to get everybody up into story time for Bible Club. So let's just call Sam as one of our kids. Can someone create a name, verb, paint scenario for me based off of and being assertive? We'll put somebody on the spot if not.
Sam, please stop running and let's line up for story time.
So let me correct you there, Karina. Okay. Were you assertive in using what you wanted the child to do or not do? So let's fix that.
Because you still said please. So this is the thing. I always went to passive. So like, hey, please, or hey, are you ready for story time? Or come on, story time, please. Okay. And it's like, nope. That gives them the option to say no.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm gonna change my personality.
Yes, that's exactly. It's so hard.
Same.
But you can still be kind while being assertive.
Yeah. Because if you're not kind, you're aggressive. So,
Right. What about, hey, Sam, stop running. It's time for story time.
Well, I would actually say no, because you're still focused on what you don't want. So what are you wanting him to do? So it would be more like, Sam, come sit down in this chair right away. That's the assertive.
So the painting a picture of what you want them to do is the part that is hard to naturally do. I don't like realizing how good it is for the kids to have the whole picture, because we kind of assume or fill in those blanks automatically, but painting the whole picture of so Sam, come over here and sit down for story time, focusing on the come or the sit or what the good
Okay.
part of it. But when we were at the door the other day, or Thursday, I guess, I'm trying to think of, because I was trying to practice this with one of our kids, the same one that yesterday I made a lot of fails with. But Thursday, I was like, wow, that worked, because he take me to Taco Bell. I want to go to Taco Bell. And he was doing a lot of the blaming and twisting things, wanting to connect, but pushing away at the same time. And I said, no, I'm not going to take you, and we can't play right now. Said, or maybe I don't even know how I said it, but I said, walk outside and I will bring you a snack bag. He said, no, take me to Taco Bell, or I'm going to play, or I'm going to go get it myself, all the options. And I just kept on. I said, no, walk outside and I will bring you a snack bag. And I had to just say it over and over. And then he just got up and went out. And I was like, oh, that worked. He did it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole shift. Like I said, I don't like the word change because it's a whole shift of your thinking. And when I failed in this, I go to more aggressive. I don't go to passive. Okay. I get more wordy. I get more angry. I'm in an emotional state. But the assertiveness, they know what you're expecting exactly. So like, I would even say, be as specific as you can. Sit in the yellow chair, right? Because the more you give them to be successful and to actually make the right choice in that moment and being assertive and say, you really don't have a choice in this, you're going to sit in this yellow chair, right? Sometimes you may have the one that rebelled, but sit in the red chair next to it and you just kind of take it as a win. But in that moment, you're getting what you need across to the child. And that's the whole point of it. We can go.
Something that I want to maybe ask, but also that I've been trying, because yesterday as I was like swinging back and forth trying to figure out from the aggressive to the assertive, it was kind of messing up multiple times. But like just thinking of being assertive, but like there are times where I have to be more, not aggressive, but more firm in our words with assertive, but we can be assertive and still like, hey, it's time for story time. Come sit in this chair. It's not, but it's creating that safety for the child. So when I'm aggressive, they're scared because they're feeling controlled. When I'm passive, they're scared because I'm not controlling them at all, because they don't have any security in that this adult is going to stick with and have the boundaries that I need. And so our kids do not know that they need structure and control, but that's what they need. But if you're an aggressive, you're fighting for control. And assertive, I'm not fighting for control at all. I'm assuring them that I do have the control. Like, we're the adults. We have the control. We need to assure them of that. And so that's where I was thinking of that it can be easy to slip into that aggressive state. But like Aaron said, if I'm slipping into the aggressive state, I'm then in my emotional brain and I'm questioning if I have control. Like yesterday, I was like, I went home and was processing. I was like, I was competing for control in that moment, and we're not going to win at that time. So,
yeah, that's a really good point. And this is where composure comes in, because I think that's the line between assertive and aggressive. No matter your tone, if you have to get a kid's attention and say, Sam, if you have to get firm, the difference between assertive and aggressive is you are composed in assertive. If you're not composed, you're aggressive. And so I think that's really the difference between the two. And a child 100% can read if you are composed yourself, because they know if you're out of control and they know the buttons to press, especially if they've worked with you before. And my teen boys know my buttons. Definitely. They like to run and get out of the cars in the middle of the street sometimes when I'm taking them places, and that just gets me all out of whack. So anyway, all right. So we can move on to our emotional mode practices. So with this is a big conversation, and all this is going to build up into the executive state, in executive mode, but choices. They're internally motivated choices bathe the brain in helpful chemicals that foster an optimistic I can attitude that increase compliance, enhance decision making, and focus attention. So whenever we give choices, we'll talk more about that in just a second, but believing outside forces control our behavior and believing we can control others' behavior are two of the same sides of the same coin. Every person is in charge of their own behavior. And so recently we've been teaching the kids in my home this, and I've been teaching the boys here this. Your choices matter, right? But your choices also don't determine who you are. And changing the narrative, like stop being bad, stop being a bad kid, to make the right choices, right? And so believing that we have the right to make our own choices in life. And when we make choices, we'll cover consequences later. And that's how it's going to build up. Because whenever I give a consequence to one of my children in my home, I say, listen, whose choice was it to make this choice? Whose choice was that? And then he'll point to himself and putting the blame on himself and not other people. And that way he can accept that consequence and understand what it means. But also, as we have a child in front of us that we're really wanting them to sit down for story time, we can continue that analogy. We can say two positive choices. You can either sit down in the yellow chair or sit down on the floor right here. That's your two choices. Both things we will win, but the child has enough control and it redirects their behavior and learns impulse control in this moment. And we need to use this while they're in an emotional mode, to shift up to executive. Mainly because when they're in an emotional state, they're not able to make these decisions. But when you say, you have control and I'm connected to you, I love you, you are loved in that moment, it helps them shift up. So let's see. This is the example I'm going to give. You have a choice. You can either read the book you chose in the calm down corner or a beanbag in the room. What is your choice? And you're giving that child a moment to choose between the two things. You're being no doubt in this moment. You're giving them the chance. Okay, you're going to read this book. This is something you're going to do in this moment in reading club or whatever. But you can choose where, and you have that control. And when you give a child a sense of control, when you're fighting for control for so many other things, you have to give a little bit of your control away to diffuse the whole situation. Because when they're in an emotional state, right? When we are in an emotional state, am I loved? Is the question we're asking. And if I don't feel like I'm in control, if I feel like someone's against me in those moments, and I don't have a choice and I'm backed into a corner, I will go down in my survival state. And that's not what we want for our kids or for ourselves. So we can go on to the next. And within this too, with emotional, encouragement is key. Encouraging children to help others creates a sense of belonging in which the intrinsic desire to be of service outshines attention-seeking behaviors. So many times, I've gone through teaching classes and things, and they said, oh yeah, just make sure that you encourage those, or you say, good job for sitting down in line, right, to this kid over here, as you're watching this kid over here stand up and dance on the other side of the room to refocus the direction. And the idea was okay, but the practicality of it is not. And so we're going to talk a little bit what Dr. McAvey calls joy juice, which is the chemicals in the brain. Joy juice is the combination of positive brain chemicals, including dopamine, oxytocin, and opioids. This brain chemistry creates joyful feeling that literally wire their brain for impulse control and willingness. So what you're doing with the joy juice and encouragement, when you're encouraging them, you're making them proud of themselves. Not worrying about, is someone across the room proud of me? I'm proud of myself. I don't need anybody else to tell me that I'm doing the right thing. I know I'm making the right choice in this moment, right? And so this is one of my favorite things. Instead of saying good job, swatch it good for you, or way to go, or you did it. That way they feel the ownership in their decision making, and you're encouraging them to have that self-worth, and you're feeding into that belief system that says, wait a minute, I'm a bad kid, right? And saying good for you, you did it. Those kind of things are essential for this. So we're going to do a little role practice here again. So we asked Sam to pick up toys with an assertive command. He did it. Okay. Now we got to follow up with an encouragement. Can someone read what I put down here in the quotation marks?
You did it. You picked up the toys and placed them in the bin right away. Good for you.
So you're telling them you did it, giving them ownership. You're telling them, painting what they did, and it sounds redundant, but affirming them that they did all these things that you asked them to do, and you're giving them an encouragement and that self-worth in that moment. And my wife uses it in her classroom, and it's amazing to see whenever they swap to, I'm proud of myself in these moments. And I forgot who it was the other day that I was working with, but I remember who it was. It was one of my teen boys, and we were at McWayne Center the other day, and I used this for him because he wasn't going to pick up his trash at the restaurant and throw it away. And I gave him assertive command to pick up his trash and throw it away. And I used this, and the fact that he was like, his face lit up like a little kid when this happened. And I was like, light bulb for me of how it changes from good job, that you need me there to tell you you did a good job, to where I can know that I did it, that I'm doing something good for myself and the people around me. All right. So within the skill of encouragement, as we talk about it, noticing is a specific skill that is essential to encouragement and is more powerful than the most lavish praise. Noticing is describing the child's actions out loud without judgment. And so with noticing, you're just telling it like it is. There's no judgment, there's no feeling behind it. It's just simply you picked up the toys and put them in the bin, right? Very simple. And it sounds redundant and it sounds crazy, but it works. It allows children to fully own their actions rather than focusing on our assessment of them. They're worried about being graded all the time, constantly. They know, like, wait a minute, I did this. And when we do this, the skill of encouragement with the choices that they make, that later on teaches them that, okay, I can make good choices. Oops, I made a bad choice this time, but it's okay. There's a power of oops and admitting that. And that starts with us as the adults in the situation too. If we are able to say, that was a bad choice for me, I got too angry with you, I had to take a moment, take a deep breath, and move forward with it. And acknowledging that in front of a child is transformative for everybody involved. If you can actually say, hey, I made a mistake and it's okay, and I'm going to make the right choice next time. Marcus, did you have a question? Okay. So does anybody have any questions so far before we move on? That's a lot of information being thrown at us. I wanted to kind of take a moment for that. Is there any pushback on any of this information? I am willing to talk about it. There's a lot more life experience on this call than I've had in my 28 years. I'm just reading from a book. So if there's any pushback on any of this, please, let's have the conversation now. I'm open for it. If not, we can move forward.
I don't feel like I've had a lot of positive experiences there. Well, so it takes practice to learn these responses, but obviously I have to be there interacting in order to practice the responses, in order to have the opportunity to build. But for the times that I have spent there, it was just frustrating. Except that, I mean, there were ways in which relationships were developed. And anyway, I love taking in this information and seeing, I mean, it all makes so much sense, but I know unless I have the chance to be there and practice and practice and practice, it's hard to do it right.
Yeah, and it's not about doing it right. And let me give you some power there, Miss Nancy, here, because with us worrying constantly about doing it the right way all the time puts way too much pressure on us as adults, right? Because I've seen more benefit from me making a mistake in front of a child than me doing it right 100% of the time. And so, but the key is we have to be acknowledging that as we go. And the fact that you're there is wonderful. You know, that's your, but at the same time, we parent and we react how we were parented. That's why I asked everyone to take that attachment quiz to really reflect of like, how do I attach to kids? How do I attach to adults? What do I do in those stress moments? Because anybody, if I'm hydrated, I'm breathing well, I feel great, I've had a good day, I'm really composed, I can do a lot of these things and be conscious of it. But if I've had multiple things go wrong all day long, it's really hard to get to my executive mode. Really hard. And I felt a lot, even with knowing all this information, even practicing it almost daily. And the power of the oops, I'm telling you, it is amazing to give yourself that grace in those moments. So thank you for mentioning that, because that's a definite struggle for all of our volunteers that we have.
And I want to say too, like Nancy, just even like you were with us when we were first trying to even implement like what does TBRI, what does trauma informed look like, and in that like there's a learning curve with all of us, and so just even just through COVID, just having much more limited interactions with kids that are short times with them outside and things when they come up, seeing the growth, not just in them, but seeing the growth in me. But to say, wow, as we are practicing over and over, so we've got to get in our head, but even with all of the head knowledge, it takes practicing and oops and making mistakes and apologizing. But in that learning curve, like we're getting to the other side where we're seeing a lot quicker response and turnaround, and remembering even as we look at these like layers of complex trauma, because each child has a different story, more or less trauma involved. Some of them have specific trauma directly that they've walked through or that has been against them, but some have incredible homes, but they're just living in a traumatic environment, right? Like I live right down the road. I'm learning how living in the traumatic environment impacts my physical body. And so as I see it impacting me, I'm able to have more patience when I see a child not being able to handle it right. But in that learning curve, we're getting there where we're seeing growth in all of us. So through the beginning, though, as we disrupted norms, because our former model at Oak Tree was very traditional, discipline kind of style. And when we went from that to, oh, let's figure out trauma-informed care, and we were more on the passive side, trying to be like, oh, let's not say no, and let's try to, in that learning phase, kids lost that sense of safety and structure. And so you were with us in person when you were regular with us multiple times a week. Like that was in a hard learning phase too. And so I'm just encouraged you even being on this call and your perseverance to say, I'm not seeing much benefit, but I feel like I still want to know and to love this community in whatever way. And so that means a lot. It means a lot to us, the grace of volunteers, because you're not the only one that have been with us through the really hard times and as we're learning it, and have still said, okay, we're figuring it out. What we were doing before wasn't working. What we're doing now, we're seeing some success, but we're also having a lot of discouragement, but we're going to move through the other side and we're going to see some progress. And I think we're just now at a phase where I'm like, wow, seeing through the other side. And wow, there's just some of our kids that now that I understand their behavior, we're able to get to the root and address that instead of just trying to control or protect them or different things. So anyway, so I just want to encourage you in that and thank you for that and being with us through so much of this. But we're still learning and still making mistakes. And yep, we always will.
Yep.
Great.
And one of the biggest things for me is that when we look at the survival mode, emotional mode, and the executive mode, and we walk through these with a child, you'll see all three of these if you get a child up to executive mode. And so it looks messy in the middle. I mean, messy. But it's okay. You're teaching this child how to go from survival mode of being basically nonverbal, or I've even said survival mode for our kids sometimes can be strictly just blurbing out random nonsense words, sometimes curse words in the middle of it. That is survival mode in my mind, because it doesn't connect to anything. And then you move up to the emotional state where a kid can be voicing like, I don't like you. I really hate you. I've literally heard this from a child. And, and bite and kick and those kind of things in the emotional state, because that kid is in their emotional state and being aggressive. But it's really messy. But I'm like, okay, that was a success. I brought him from survival to emotional. And that is a success for this child in front of me. And we have to realize that and give ourselves some grace. We're not miracle workers, right? But if you get a child up to the executive mode from that point, and we've had successes with this, you're like, whew, okay, we did it. But it's messy in between. And to the outside person that's looking in, coming from survival mode, if the kid's quiet over in the corner and you're trying to bring him out to emotional mode, they're like, why the heck did you do that? The kid was fine, right? And so we're learning, but we're trying to help children learn how to self-regulate, how to get to where they need to be and make the right choices. And it is our goal is to teach. And to teach, you have to go through the mess. So executive mode practices is positive intent. We must see children differently in order for them to behave differently. I cannot tell you how much this matters. And this is why I ask you to take the implicit bias test for this training. Because if we see our kids as a threat as soon as they walk through that gate, that's going to be a problem from the get-go. Right? And so we have to understand that our implicit biases, our attachment matters in all of this. So our positive intent, we have to shift our change. We have to change our thinking, change our perspective, quit taking it personally in these moments. So example, a child is grabbing all the puppets at Reading Club. No other child can get a puppet. This is a real instance that we've had many, many times here at the Treehouse. And the negative intent that we can put on a child about as an adult, he's trying to steal all the puppets away from all the other kids, right? And that may very well be the case. He doesn't want any other kids to have it. But when you say to the child, oh, did you want to make sure you and your reading buddy had enough puppets? That immediately diffuses the situation to where that child doesn't feel like you're attacking them in that moment. And you're changing that focus of like, oh, he wanted to make sure he had enough puppets for his reading buddy. And you can say, well, actually, I think you only need about 3 puppets. Would you like to, and then move from there and let him, it's like your choice is this or this, and make the choices in that moment. And teaching him how to go through that moment with positive intent matters. Dr. Becca Bailey tells a story about a kid, that was supposed to take her to the office with her. And she was working with this kid. She didn't know he went to school for anything. And so she's like, this is not the way to the office. And he takes her to the boiler room of the school. Okay. And she's like, uh-oh, is this kid going to try to kill me? Like, really? The boiler room of all places? And he had some extreme behaviors. He was a little older. But in truth, this is the only place in the entire school where that child felt safe. And he didn't want to go to the office. And so we can shift our focus and shift our thinking about a child's intent. And this helps me even think better about our children when I see this happening, like even to fights. Like I shift thinking like, oh, he's wanting connection when he's fighting. And that's how I see fights now. And we're shifting that and teaching in those moments, of course, but we see it in a different light. You can go on to the next one. So consequences, I told you when we were talking about choices, we're going to get here. And so you're going to teach children to examine their behavior, reflect on impact of the choices, and make changes until they reach their highest goal. Now, this is a huge thing, but can a child in their emotional state really understand the impact of their choices and make changes until they reach their goal? Or if they're in their survival state? Listen, can a child do that? No, not at all. So we are never to give consequences to a child until they and me are in our executive mode, which is why here at the treehouse, many times we have had kids that have major upset moments, fighting moments, unsafe moments for other kids around them. And immediately what we want to do is send them home and out the gate. It's the consequence. And we might want to, but we have to stay connected to them in their emotional state and bring them to executive mode and say, hey, bud, you have a choice. You can choose to sit quietly and do this, and you can stay, or you can choose to continue hitting people again and have to go. Remember, we keep it safe and stick it together. And stick together. Tell me what will happen if you, and then you have a conversation with the kid. Tell me what will happen if you hit again. And if they can respond back to you, they understand their consequences. If the behavior persists, I can see by your actions, you chose to go home, right? Because you hit. And provide empathy, because at that moment they're going to go all kind of craziness when you say you have to go home, and you'll say, you seem very mad right now. You were hoping that you could stay. It's hard. Breathe with me. You are safe, and you can handle it. And we can change our verbiage on this, because sometimes this is to a 16-year-old, it's going to sound like you're talking to me like a kindergartner. Stop, right? And we can shift this. But this is just a good way to do it, because the empathy is key at the end, because we're not just strictly giving out consequences to control children. We're helping them regulate themselves as we go. And so before
go ahead. I want to give an example of the soccer experience that we had recently, because I think it happened not necessarily. Yeah, I think it just all of us together on this. So our kid, Holy Rosary, the Catholic Church around for us, does soccer, and North Star Ministries, they've been coming together. And so they've got soccer teams for our kids. It's been great. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I went to a soccer game and was helping out, and our kids got into a very bad fight. And it was just a really unfortunate situation. And the whole other team was like backed up as all of our kids went in. And the boy ended up having a broken leg, just very serious injuries from it. And in that moment, I quickly saw how everyone, well, from the beginning, when our team arrived at the field, everyone saw our kids as a threat, right? And then they unfortunately proved it to be true through a real bad fight and an incident. But what happened was the other child, whether or not there was verbal stuff before, that's not the point, but the other child actually hit one of our girls in the face. And the sister and the cousin came in to defend her. And he picked the wrong kid, like they were going to have her back, right? And so immediately when we got them apart, and when the refs got up there, they backed up, they did their part and they backed up. And so the refs were in their face, pointing, yelling, "You've got a red card," and all of that. And I took a moment and I said, I understand their consequences, they're out, but they can't hear you right now. They're going to walk with me. And so I took them because their adrenaline was pumping so much, they were just crying, right? People saw you are bad, dangerous kids. But what their body was doing was going into survival mode and fight and defend. They had to protect their sister, their cousin. And so as we walked, I said, y'all breathe with me. And we breathed multiple times because I knew any lecture or thing that I gave them at that moment, they couldn't hear, right? So we breathed, we walked it off, sat down, gave them a snack and a drink. And I said, that must have been really scary to lose control and to fight like that. You feel that adrenaline in your body, and talk to them about what that adrenaline was doing. And they were like, yeah, because she could have lifted a car at that moment. She fought hard. She could have done some major damage. Well, she did. And so I'd say that's not fun. Our kids don't like to be in that situation. They don't choose to. But I reframe to say that child has had to survive her whole life. She knows how to fight when she needs to. And so I said, you know what, guys? I love that you protected one another. You had each other's back. You were a team that went in it together. I said, but what we can't do is hurt other people. So we need to talk about to be prepared where next time someone makes you angry or you feel in threat, that you don't have to fight and put yourself and others in more harm. But we couldn't have that conversation until I had emotionally connected with them. And then they were in their executive functioning and they were calm. So then we sat down and we said, okay, so tell me what was going on. Well, they were running their mouth. The ref wasn't calling them, all this. He hit her in the face. Said, okay, so next time, step one, we need to talk to an adult. If that's the ref or your coach or me, whoever's there, to that you are safe here when there are adults there. You don't have to fight to protect yourself. So that when somebody else does something bad, you get to finish the game because now you're punished, right? Now you guys are losing the game because all of you are out of the game. And so they were able to understand those natural consequences and to see, oh, I had a choice. I can either fight and have these consequences, or I can do it kind of the less natural way, the harder way, and go talk to an adult. We had to talk through snitching and all of that. Well, the girl that did the most damage, she's out for the season. But the coaches came and sat down with us and we talked about, okay, how can we support our kids trauma-informed way? Praise the Lord for these coaches' grace and compassion, because all of the teams that are in this league watching them said, you need to get rid of those kids. They can't be in our league. They're dangerous. But you know what that would do? Creates more distance. Our kids have more time on the streets without activity, and they're going to continue in this spiral. But instead, what one of the coaches did was wrote a card to the one girl and said, I'm so sad you're going to be out. I'm so sad that this happened. I really want you on our team. You're a great soccer player. Spoke into her the truth and reframing that identity, because what she expected in that moment is you're bad, you hurt somebody, you're dangerous, all of those things. That he spoke, reframed it, and said, I'm sorry you had to protect your sister. I'm sorry that was scary. I'm really sad that you hurt that boy. And I'm sad that here's the consequences, that you're out for the season. And I'm really sad. I wonder if you have thought about that boy who also can't play and who's now has a broken leg. And he positively framed it and said, I think you might like to talk to him about how he's feeling and give him a get well card. Here's a card if you want to do that. And he gave her the option to do that. And he asked us what we thought. And I said, I don't know if she's going to be ready for that. Like, I think she's probably pretty mad at that boy still. Said, but what you're doing is right. You are speaking truth into her true identity, not defining her by her mistakes and what she did while she was in survival mode. He didn't justify that it was okay what she did. He said there were real, very serious consequences, right? But she couldn't go to the games, but she intentionally went to practice, made a special trip to deliver that letter to the coach to write an apology to that little boy. And he thought we put her up to it. And I said, I didn't talk to her at all. She did that on her own because he gave an opportunity for her and said, you're a great soccer player. I want you on our fall team, but we're going to help support you to where you don't have to react to your anger, where you can have control over your anger. And so Megan and Aaron and Parita were able to go to practice and have small group sessions of role playing with them to prepare them so that when they get on the field and they're triggered, when our kids understand how their brain works and that they're triggered, they can have power over it just like we can. And so coach texted and said, best game we've ever played. Can't believe how much progress that they had after they had those breakout sessions. And I'm like, wow, it makes a difference. So that took all of us holistically, and it's not easy. It's a lot. It takes a lot more work to stick with a child when they're in their survival and emotional state. It's a lot more self-sacrificing. Like we have to do the hard part of carrying their emotions in us, like through that moment, to help them move through it and for those emotions not to control or define them. Anyway, so I just wanted to give that as an example because I feel like that's a win that we don't see as clearly very often. But and what can happen when our kids have holistic support? What if every adult they interacted with had this framework? Anyway. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And as we go forward with this, one thing I forgot to mention during the assertive and survival mode things is that actually here at Oak Tree, we have just agreed to change rules. Before it was stick together, no hurts, have fun. So which rule do you think that was taken away based off of what we've learned today? That's kind of a conclusion before we go on to the next conversation. So stick together, no hurts, have fun. Angela or Nancy, do you have any ideas of which rule was taken out?
Was it no hurts?
It was no hurts. Now let's keep it safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're focusing on what we want to get with that. And so we're learning and we're shifting as we learn as a staff. And so just be gracious with us as you come and interact with our kiddos and us.
And we talked about that doesn't mean we never say no hurts. We
Right.
describe keep it safe as you will do no hurts, but positive intent from the beginning, and it has their mindset of they are a part of the action of keeping it safe with us.
Yeah.
For them and others.
There's a whole other section of constant discipline called the school family and how to build that. And this is the building blocks for that. And so we'll discuss those at a later date, but that's a key thing, but is something that we do as a staff and build a culture of the treehouse itself that we do. But here we're going to talk about self-care. And so something we haven't done well as a staff or as with our volunteers, and we apologize for that, is offer good self-care as our volunteers and prevent against compassion fatigue. Because so many times we walk into the situation thinking, oh, these kids, they need my help. They need help reading. They need whatever. And we'll end up in compassion fatigue because our expectations are set on achieving certain things with kids in front of us or adults that we are working with. And at that point, we're consciously compassionate. We know we have a care for this community. We know we love this community, but we don't know how to competently actually help and to be a part of this. And so what the fire in the middle is really our expectations. It's unconscious, premeditated resentment that we have against the work that we do. Because many times we'll go from consciously compassionate about working, because I've been doing this with my teen boys of what they've been involved in and things of like, I care for these boys, but I have no idea what I'm doing. But I've had the expectation on myself that I could help them. And it became a premeditated resentment that I have against the situation. And we all have to go through this fire. It's part of it, to realize what is our part, what is our role, how can I be competently compassionate for the kids here at Oak Tree and the adults here at Oak Tree. And one thing that we're going to commit to is for our volunteers is offer up some debriefing at as much as we can at the end, so we can talk about it right after it happens, and debrief with our volunteers and our staff of like, okay, today was a hard day. You know, what was your picture of the day? What was your takeaway from today, negative or positive? And talking through those things really help us know, one, our expectations coming in and what were our letdowns. And so I think Raquel has a good point to bring out at this point.
Yeah, and I think, just a commitment to care for one another and to be there to debrief and just to share more openly. A lot of times the volunteers come in, either they're coming in once a week or once a month for Bible club or reading club, and they see one little snippet of what Oak Tree does when we're here all week, and we are going through a lot of different things. And so in a lot of, some of even what I said earlier, Nancy, of just, we've been in survival mode as a ministry of we're learning, how do we walk through this? We've been serving in the community since 2012, but in that time, I've had different changes and turnovers and different phases of ministry and learning and being with the community, walking with them, experiencing the things that they experience and saying, okay, we're in this together and we don't have all the answers. We're not here because we have all the answers or because we're here to save or rescue anyone, right? We're here to walk in this together. And for us, especially as staff or volunteers who are involved with us in every activity, secondary trauma is a real thing as we carry stories, especially carrying stories of children. When we know some of the background of what children have been through, when we know some of the things that the parents are going through, when we know some of the stories of even generational trauma passed down, and we are carrying those stories, it can burn us out. If we're not learning to debrief and process those together, lay them at the feet of Jesus and to say, Jesus isn't asking me to carry something that he hasn't already carried himself, he hasn't already paid for. This is a process. And so last year, we've talked about compassion fatigue or secondary trauma, and I've mentioned those things and I had a head knowledge of them, but it wasn't until last year when COVID took me out and all of a sudden I was down for 2 months trying to understand why, when I'm a young, healthy 30-year-old, is COVID knocking me down for 2 months? It wasn't until then that I had a realization of what secondary trauma does and what compassion fatigue does. And so for me, being in this work for 5 years and carrying stories of people and trying to figure out how to lead Oak Tree forward and gain new team members and trying at different phases to run all of the ministries and be there for all of the kids and everything, it wasn't sustainable. Living here and being next to the shootings when they happen and walking out with people and saying, who was it that died this time? Those are things that if you're in this work, the secondary trauma, you will begin to see the world differently. when you watch the news and you hear stories, you will have questions of, is that our kids, or when will it be our kid up there next, And so those kind of things impact, when we look at trauma, the list before, where it affects our bodies, our brains, our biology, our belief system, all of that. We have to be aware, not just looking at how that impacts our kids, but being aware, learning mindfulness to be aware of ourselves. And this is where I see growth in us as a team, and we're figuring it out. But honestly, me going through a really hard year last year of realizing, I have to learn to take care of my body. And this trauma impacts the way I'm thinking. I can't remember things anymore. So when we talk about our kids and how they struggle in school, like, I understand that on a different way, because all of a sudden I was like, I feel like I'm going crazy and I can't remember simple things anymore. And so learning about those things and saying, okay, we have to learn sustainable rhythms in this. We have to learn how to debrief. We have to learn how to lament, which is a very biblical discipline that the church in America, the white church, is not equipped in. But we have to learn these things in order to have healthy rhythms to care for ourselves, and to not be in this consciously compassionate. Like, we know we need to be compassionate and we love people, but then we burn out because we have these expectations of, we've been told, like, oh, go and love people like Jesus, or if this child has one consistent relationship, their whole life will change. And we hear those kind of statistics, and it's just not that simple. And that's not the reality, right? Complex trauma. It's going to be complex, and it's going to be a long, hard journey to persevere with these children and with our neighbors, and with us. And so we have to shift our expectations and to be aware, like, God is doing work in us in this. So there's an article, I wish I could remember who wrote it, but a blog that I've shared with the team that really helped me, even in that dark season of looking at compassion, just the word. We know our God is a God of compassion. He gives us the ability to have empathy and care for others. But compassion, being co-passion, co-suffering. If you step into this work and God draws your heart to Mark's Village and you are connected with these kids, you are committing to co-suffer. And this isn't something that we take lightly. People who volunteer with us, we understand the sacrifice that comes with that. I understand the sacrifice that my team members have to come on staff here. You are signing up to co-suffer with our community and with Christ, because Christ is compassionate. If we look at how many times he was moved with compassion, moved with weeping for the people that he loved, we're signing up to say, we choose to suffer with you. We're not here because we're exempt from suffering or we have answers. We choose to step in and make ourselves vulnerable to the trauma that you experience, because we believe that relationships offer healing and Jesus offers hope, and it is worth it. When Christ said, pick up your cross, it comes a different meaning when you're standing out here and shooting starts to happen, right? By God's grace, our volunteers don't have, nothing has happened at Oak Tree, right? But for those of us who are here throughout the week, or we live here, we hear those things. We hear the shots and the sirens before we hear the news story. And so that's the real sacrifice. But again, that's why we took time to give the bigger picture of the context too. When God says in Isaiah 61 that he will raise up oaks of righteousness to repair the generational devastations, it's a sacrifice. And we understand that not everyone is going to choose that, and people will support our ministry in different ways. And we need the body of Christ to support in different ways, in order, all using their giftings in order to fuel this work. But we are in healing work. How we do anything is to offer healing from trauma and to say, it does not have to be this way. We don't have to what we're teaching our kids when we're bringing them from survival to emotional to executive state is to say, you don't have to live in survival mode. Yes, the way that the systems are set up against you, you have to be able to survive. And that has created a hardness in you. But there's a better way. We can. This is why as a ministry, we've got to look at things holistically too, right? We have to care for the parents and give offering for them to be healing. And we'll talk more about that in community support. But yeah, so we have to step in and say we need the body of Christ and all of its giftings to be raised up as oaks of righteousness. We need God to do this mutual transformation in us. We need him to sustain us as we say we are willing to suffer alongside. And this isn't this savior complex suffering where it's like, oh, I'm going to suffer and look at me, I'm so great. That's not it at all. When you're in it, that's not going to sustain you long. It's not that, but it's to say, I believe God is here and doing work in me and in you when we do this together. And our treasure is in heaven. This kingdom mindset allows us to see this temporary suffering as what it is. It's temporary. And we are working for something much bigger and greater and eternal. So anyways, sorry, I went off on a tangent. I think I'm preaching to my own heart right now, but we are aware of the sacrifices that come as you step in, and anyone who wants to volunteer with us. And we do encourage everyone to ask, like, what is God asking me to do in this ministry? And that might be serving from a distance. It might be serving on the ground. But regardless, we need all of us in order to be sustained in this ministry.
Yeah. Thanks, Raquel. This is a hard conversation to have because we have to really open up about our expectations and become more self-aware about them. You know, if we come up with a fixing mentality, so many times we get burnt out really quickly. So just thank you for being willing to be part of this training today. You can go to the next slide, Raquel, and we can kind of follow up. One of my favorite things is everyone's learning alongside of us as we do this. We're not claiming we know everything. We're not claiming we know what's best. We're learning as we go, but we do know that these practices do work and they've been proven. And so I do encourage you to go on there and do some research for yourself if you want to. There's a lot of good videos on Facebook on conscious discipline. There's a lot of great things with Trauma Free World that you can take. Even in Trauma Free World has a really good self-care section as well for you if you have a high stress job or anything else. So, but yeah, I think we're going to end with the trauma prayer, right, Raquel? You want to lead that?
Yes, I wanted to share it. Let me share it where you guys can see it. This, actually, can you guys see that? I don't know if it's sharing at the right spot. Hang on. This resource, and sorry, I just realized how long we're going over time, but thank you for sticking with us. But this is just a liturgy, a prayer for those who encounter trauma in the field, and it's from written by Amy Young. She's got just some great resources for cross-cultural workers, and that I benefit from a lot. And so I'm just going to read this, and in the bold where it says, "Help us, Lord," you can read it yourself out loud. There's just power in communal prayer together. And yeah, so Lord, this is for those who encounter trauma in the field, which is to say it is for all of us. It is for me. Often we are unequipped or under-equipped for the trauma we encounter. We don't know the full history, the cultural norms, or the reasons that have come together to cause this harm. Thus, we are unequipped or under-equipped for the ensuing conversations and horrors we hear and decisions we might be asked to make. Help us, Lord. As we encounter historical trauma, help us to hold history and hope, joining with Christ, who taught us to pray for the kingdom of God to come to earth. May it come even in this, even here. Help us, Lord. As we encounter those affected by natural disasters, even long forgotten ones, help us to listen and stand and witness to the devastation. You have done it before. Again, we ask you to calm these storms. Help us, Lord. As we encounter cruelty done to fellow humans and creatures, help us to remember you are a God who weeps. We ask for healing for what has happened, and that through the works of our hands, future harm is prevented. Help us, Lord. As we encounter trauma to our own minds, bodies, and souls, help us to turn to you, turn to each other, turn to experts and caregivers. Help us grow in our capacity to suffer with those who suffer, and heal us, O Lord, from these wounds of our work, trusting that we are not damaged goods. O God, who has seen all and not given up on humanity, may we bear your image in the trauma we encounter. Amen. Thank you guys for being with us and sticking with us, and those who are going to watch this later. We truly cannot thank you enough. We can't do this work at Oak Tree without all of you who support and serve, and we love you guys. So thank you. We'll see you later.